Okay, so can someone, since we are going to begin with something that's in the middle of the Parsha, then God willing, time-wise, we'll be able to go to the beginning of the Parsha and the end of the Parsha before Minyan. I asked you to turn to Numbers 28 in Parashat Pinchas. So as I said, this is the most famous part of the Parsha, there is such a thing, chapter 28 of Pinchas. So for example, if you look at page 930 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, or if you have a different Chumash and you're in the book of Numbers, chapter 28, and if you look at verse 9, and we go to, well, let's start with that and see if it sounds vaguely familiar. It might to some of you sound more familiar in Hebrew than in English. Actually, Reuben, will you read it for us?
וביום השבת שני כבשים בני שנה תמימים ושני עשרונים. סולת מנחה בלולה בשמן ונזכו, עולת שבת בשבתו, עולת התמיד ונזכו.
Keep going. Verse 11.
חודשי חודשיכם תקריבו עולה לאדוני, פרים בני בקר, שניים והעיל אחד, כבשים בני שנה שבעה תמימים.
Okay, stop there. So that sounds familiar. And the fact that you read it with a trope instead of just stam reading it, I wasn't intending for you to perform or to do any laning, but I know you know that Parsha, so maybe I did very unintentionally, intentionally call on you to do that. The English. Rip, will you read the English for us in verse 11, Numbers 28, verse 11.
Okay, verse 11. Hold on. Let's see. I see 9. Verse 11. Oh, on your new moons, you shall present a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, and 7 yearling lambs without blemish. Should I keep going?
You don't have to keep going, but you can just skim with your eyes and you look and see the rest of the section here is the rest of the ingredients of the sacrifice. And when is this particular korban? When is this particular sacrifice supposed to be offered? It's indicated right in verse 11. So anyone want to shout that out? Who's not rooted?
Rosh Chodesh.
Rick, good. Helen. And Helen knows. Helen's my Rosh Chodesh queen. Some of you may not know, but when Helen happens to be in shul and it's Rosh Chodesh, she has a special shirt that she wears. That's a Rosh Chodesh shirt. It has a moon on it, or a sliver of a moon, something moon-like on it. And here in chapter 28, verse 11, Uverashei chodshechem. So this section of Pinchas is, when I say it's read oftentimes during the year, if it's just Rosh Chodesh, if it's a weekday Rosh Chodesh, and say it's a Thursday and there's Helen with her Rosh Chodesh shirt and it's time to read the Torah, then we only read this section from Pinchas. In fact, it's divided into 4 aliyot, unlike a regular weekday, which would have only 3 aliyot, or Shabbat that has 7 aliyot. Rosh Chodesh gets, not as much as Shabbat, but a little more, bissel more than the 3 that you would get on a regular weekday. And the reading is from this book from this parsha, from Bamidbar, chapter 28. It's from verses 1 through 15. And it's divided into, the first aliyah is verses 1 through 3. The second aliyah, I believe, is 3 through 5. 3 is actually repeated. Then verses 6 through 10, then verses 11 through 15. If Rosh Chodesh happens to be on Shabbat, then whatever the regular Torah reading is for that Shabbat, let's say it's Parashat Pinchas. Let's say, for example, Parashat Pinchas coincided with Rosh Chodesh. It doesn't, but if it did, we would read from Parashat Pinchas, we read from Parashat Pinchas, the first bunch of aliyot for Shabbat, so we still would have 7. But our maftir, instead of the maftir reading being a subset of aliyah 7, it would be then this special section from Parashat Pinchas that is for Rosh Chodesh. So let me give a better example than this week. I'll give you an actual example. Next month. Okay, next week. Great. That's we don't have to look too far into the future to find out that July 10th is actually Rosh Chodesh Elul. And Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Chodesh Av. Sorry, I'm a month ahead of time. Rosh Chodesh Av is on a Shabbos, and it is on that day we read the regular Torah reading for that day. Plus, in addition to that, we will read this section from Pinchas Bamidbar chapter 28, verses 9 through 15. So starting from where Reuben was chanting from the Uviyom HaShabbat, Shnei Kvasim B'nei Shana, from all the way there until the end of 15. I'm going to share something with you. If I know that I have hopefully introduced some of you to Sefaria, and that's a nice little thing to know about, but something else that's really nice to know about, a nice little useful online tool, is HebCal, which is the Hebrew calendar. So let me show you a couple of things. Okay, so first.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I've used that for years. It's great.
HebCal, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. It's HebCal, but I'm thinking Heb like Hebrew. So HebCal.com. If you look something up, if you get onto this website, you have a chance to, you can customize a calendar. And how do we do that? And what would be the purpose of that? So, here, 2021 calendar, customized calendar settings. You click on here, and I clicked off everything. Some things you can click off multiple, some things you can only click one or the other. So for example, you can't do diaspora holiday schedule and Israel holiday schedule, I don't think. Let me see. No, you have to do one or the other. Okay, so you did create calendar. And there you go. You have the whole 2021 calendar with Hebrew dates on every date of the year. Let me just go back one more because I can show you that. Right here, there's a choice of, you can show Hebrew date every day of the year, or you could show Hebrew date just for dates with some event, like a holiday or whatnot. So I'm doing show Hebrew date every day of the year. I'm going to go back to create calendar, and we're going to look specifically at July of 2021. July of 2021, you see here that on July 10th is Rosh Chodesh Av. So there is a Torah reading, and the way HebCal works, they color code. So the regular Torah reading for the week is in green. So the regular Torah reading for this coming Shabbos, July 3rd, is Parashat Pinchas. The regular Torah reading for July 10th, the first of Av, is Parashat Matot Maseh. But because it is Rosh Chodesh Av, in addition to reading what we read from Parashat Matot Maseh, we read from a second Torah scroll. And from that second Torah scroll, what we're reading is Pinchas. So I already pulled that up here.
From the Czech Torah too.
From the Czech Torah, yeah. About Rosh Chodesh. So if you look here, so this I clicked on from, so you can focus on what the Torah reading is. Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, Saturday, July 10th. The Maftir reading is Numbers 28, 9 through 15. And then you can click on it, and it should, yeah, it actually pulls you right to Sephora. Okay, and it shows you the whole shebang there. Okay. Another example. Okay, so that's Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh Elul, which is on a weekday, is right here, August 8th. So on August 8th, we don't have a regular Torah reading. That's a Shabbos Torah reading. We don't Parshat Re'eh, we'll read on Shabbos, not on Sunday. So on this day, on August 8th, we'll read this section from Parashat Pinchas all the way from the beginning of chapter 28 to verse 15 and divide it into 4 aliyot. Another time where we might read something from Parashat Pinchas. So not this section, this particular section we read was for Rosh Chodesh, but there's something else. Passover. Okay, so on Pesach, if you look at the Torah readings for Pesach, again, this is taken from HebCal. I had gone into the calendar and just clicked on the date, Sunday, March 28th. Corresponding to first day of Pesach, 15th of Nisan. So there's the regular Torah portion that we read for the holiday, which is from the book of Shmot, it's Parshat Bo. And then this part here, this Numbers part here, the Maftir, that is from Parshat Pinchas. Okay, same thing with second day Pesach. Second day Pesach is same exact Maftir Torah reading. The Torah reading is slightly different for the first 5 aliyot, but the Maftir is still from Pinchas. If you look at the rest of Pesach, all of Chol HaMoed, so on all the Chol HaMoed days, we have 4 aliyot, and the fourth of those aliyot is again from Pinchas. Again, from Pinchas. You go look, and it's the same verses. If you look at from day 3 through day 8 of Pesach, the Maftir reading is Numbers 28, 19 through 25, right? And this is, again, you can click on it and then it'll take you directly to it right there. Okay, so All right, so let us look at what the Pesach reading is, right? So I just went back.
May I just ask a question, Rabbi?
Yes, go
Is,
ahead.
is this section read every single Rosh Chodesh?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
every single Rosh Hashanah. In fact, I have fond memories of two very special people from the Philadelphia area who are members of my community there. One, his name is Danny Solzberg. He died a few years ago of pancreatic cancer, more than a few years ago. He died 13 years ago. There's a bench named after him in a park, right, very close to my house in Philadelphia. Danny Solzberg owned a bookstore in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, and it was his parents' store. I don't think he did much business, but because his father worked 7 days a week, he worked 7 days a week. He kept that store open 7 days a week. So he was never able to come to shul on Shabbat morning, but he made a commitment to himself and to our community that he would be our Rosh Chodesh reader, that anytime we had a Rosh Chodesh reading that was on a weekday before going into the office, that he would read Rosh Chodesh. So this man, he knew no other Torah reading, but he knew Rosh Chodesh and he knew it backwards and forwards. So that when he was on his deathbed, one of the things we did together is he read Torah in bed, and he couldn't even see anymore at the end. His eyes were all, but he knew his Rosh Chodesh, the same Rosh Chodesh reading every single time. As I said, the only differences would be if it's on Shabbat versus on a weekday, the reading slightly different, still from chapter 28 of the book of Numbers of Bamidbar, but a different, it's a longer section when it's a weekday versus Shabbat, it's a shorter section because we have that whole other Torah reading to do. As for Pesach, also every Pesach we read those. So if you know Parashat Pinchas, if Pinchas happens to be your bar mitzvah portion, for example, and you learn the chapter 28 part for your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, then you have a very marketable skill, because every time Rosh Chodesh comes around, every time a holiday comes around, you are able to read. So let's take a little closer look at chapter 28, just so you can see if you can spot some of the other Torah readings just by virtue of what the topic is. Okay, so I showed you on Numbers chapter 28, verse 16. It says, will someone read that verse in English? Just raise your hand if you want to read. Ruth, you're on. You have to just unmute.
In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, there shall be a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. And on the 15th day of that month, a festival. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. The first day shall be a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupation. You shall present an offering by fire, a burnt offering to the Lord, 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, and 7 yearling lambs. See that they are without blemish. The meal offering with them shall be of choice flour with oil mixed in. Prepare 3/10 of a measure for a bull, 2/10 for a ram, and for each of the 7 lambs prepare 1/10 of a measure. And there shall be.
I'm going to stop you there, Ruth. Just the rest of it is the rest of the sacrifice recipe for which holiday? Passover, right? So it makes sense that would be the reading on Passover. But on Passover, we don't only read that. We read that, but we also read other sections of the Tanakh, of the other sections of the Chumash that tell more of the narrative of the story that we know as the Passover story. So, for example, on Passover day 1, we read from Parashat Bo, which is some of the 10 plagues. It's the ending part right before the Yetziat Mitzrayim, right before the Exodus from Egypt. And then the Maftir reading would then be from Parashat Pinchas. Now, if we skip ahead in the same chapter to verse 26, so again, we're still in chapter 28, Pinchas, will someone read that in English and or in Hebrew? Elaine, do you want to read?
Sure. On the day of the first fruits, your feast of weeks, when you bring an offering of new grain, more light here, to the Lord, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall present a burnt offering of pleasing odor to the Lord. 2 bulls of the herd, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs.
Okay, stop. So what holiday are we talking about here? And when would we read this in shul as our maftir?
The Feast of Weeks, that's Sukkot, isn't it?
It's not,
Shavuos.
yeah, right. The
Okay,
word weeks
Well,
means
the one, yeah, the
Shavuot,
one.
right?
Wrong,
Shavuot
yes.
means weeks. The word for Hebrew word for week is Shavuah, plural Shavuot. So it's not called Chag HaShavuot here. If you look in the Hebrew in verse 26, what is this holiday called? Reese, you need to unmute.
Chag HaBikurim.
Right. So it's called, the first two words in verse 26 are Uviyom HaBikurim. Bikurim means first fruits, on the day of the first fruits. And it says here, your feast of weeks. It doesn't say that anywhere in here, like the word Shavuot doesn't appear, but we know we read this on Shavuos. Now look in chapter 29. Chapter 29, the first verse. Would someone like to read that?
Isn't the Bikurim is visit? So how does that relate?
Okay, so let me answer Gila's question. Go back to verse 26. Bikur, as in visit, is with a kuf. Okay, I'm going to put that in the chat, right? So bikur, like when we say bikur cholim, like visiting the sick. Okay, so bikur cholim, that would be written like that. You see it in the chat, bet kuf vav resh. But here, Yom HaBikurim, that's in verse 26 of chapter 28 in Parashat Pinchas, is spelled that way.
Okay.
See, with bet chaf vav resh. So it actually comes from the same root as bechor, as in makat bechorot, as in the last plague, the plague of the firstborn. Here, it's called Yom HaBikurim because it's the first fruit. So the word bechor, Bikurim, means first fruits, first child, first something. So incidentally, the big trip that people in their 20s and now older can go on for free, the birthright trip. The word for birthright is bichora. It's the special blessing that goes to the eldest child. But when the people were putting together the birthright trip, they thought people would have trouble pronouncing bichora. So they decided to just call it taglit, which just means like journey. You know, it doesn't actually mean birthright. So that trip was supposed to be called Bechora, but Bechora, Bikurim, Bechor, Makat Bechorot, all the same word. So Yom HaBikurim. But now let's go to chapter 29, verse 1. Okay, and would someone like to read chapter 29, verse 1, and then we can see which holiday this is attached to? Al, do you want to do it?
In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupation. You shall observe it as the day when the horn is sounded. You should present the burnt offering, etc.
Okay, yeah, and the rest of the recipe. Okay, so what holiday is that, Red?
Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah, right. Okay, so it doesn't say Rosh Hashanah. And with something you might find curious, in the first verse, it doesn't say in the first month, on the first day of the month. We think of Tishrei as the first month of the year. In the biblical way of ordering the months, when they say the first month of the year, they're talking about Nisan, the month where Passover is. So that Tishrei is the 7th month of the year. So we call it Rosh Hashanah. They didn't call it Rosh Hashanah, although the rabbis, by the time of the Talmud, they acknowledged that there were multiple Rosh Hashanahs during the year for different purposes, including the Rosh Hashanah that we know and love and call Rosh Hashanah. That's the Tishrei one. That's one of the 4 that are mentioned in the Talmud. It's very similar to the secular calendar when we have January 1st is New Year's, but many people think of the beginning of the fiscal year, July 1st. People think about tax season and April 15th being an end of a year with extensions much later than that. But there are different ways to conceive of beginning of the year. The school year, the academic year starts end of August or beginning of September. It doesn't start in January. So too here in chapter 29, verse 1 of Parashat Pinchas, this is the reading that is for Rosh Chodesh. And Al, of course, knows this because Al is our man behind the scenes, sometimes in front of the scenes, but who rolls the Torahs, who sets up all the yahrzeit lights at Temple Beth Am. And when he rolls the Torahs, he has to know exactly where to go. So you, of all people, would know where this is. But if you weren't Al and you weren't someone who's rolling Torahs, how would you know that this is referring to Rosh Hashanah? First of all, because it says in the 7th month on the first day of the month. So if you know that 7th month refers to Tishrei, 1st of Tishrei, that might be a tip-off. But there's another tip-off also in that same verse.
When the horn is sounded.
Yeah, when the horn is sounded. So the word shofar is not used, but it says truah, yom teruah yelachem. What are the sounds of the shofar? Right, the truah, there's tekiah, shivarim, teruah, Trua, there actually was a whole machloket, a whole debate in the Jewish codes of what is a trua. When you say Yom Trua, does it sound like this? Does it sound broken? Does it sound like a trumpet? What does it sound like? And that's how we ended up with all three of those sounds, because there were different understandings of what the word trua meant. So Yom Trua, that's what Rosh Hashanah is called. Just how back in verse 26, Shavuot wasn't called Shavuot, it's called Yom HaBikurim. Here in chapter 29, Rosh Hashanah is not called Rosh Hashanah, it's called Yom Trua. Now skip ahead to verse 7. We're in chapter 29, and if someone would read that. Risa, unmute.
Okay. On the 10th day of this 7th month, it shall be a sacred holiday to you, when you shall fast and not do any work. You shall bring a burnt offering for a pleasant aroma to Adonai, consisting of 1 young bull, 1 ram, and 7 yearling lambs.
Okay.
They shall all be without blemish.
Okay, etc., etc. All right, so what holiday is that?
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur. So again, it's not called Yom Kippur. And it's interesting, your translation. I'd love to see other people's translations, what you have for verse 7. The Hebrew is Be'asor lachodesh hashvi'i. So that means on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's probably pretty similar in all of ours. The Hebrew that I'm referring to is V'initem et nafshotechem. Risa, your translation was you shall fast. Does anyone have a different English translation for instead of you shall fast? What do you have, Ruben? Or
Affliction.
You shall afflict yourself.
you shall afflict yourself. Does anyone else have that? Or something
No,
like
you
that?
shall observe a sacred occasion when you shall practice self-denial.
Okay, so that's in the Eitz Chaim. So we have fasting, self-denial, affliction, all of them being translations of V'initem et nafshotechem. So it doesn't actually say fast. And for those of us who are studying Daf Yomi, the Talmud, the 7.5-year Talmud cycle, we're studying Masechet Yoma, which the starting point and ending point of Masechet Yoma is Yom Kippur. And this is the section we're talking about. It's chapter 8 of Masechet Yoma, talks about the 5 different afflictions of Yom Kippur, and keeps coming back to this verse saying it's not really clear that you're supposed to fast. Now in Risa's translation, Risa didn't translate it, but the book she has, is already assuming that we understand that what does it mean to afflict oneself or to practice self-denial? It's to abstain from eating and drinking. But in the days of the Talmud, they were still figuring this out, and they had multiple restrictions. And in fact, all of these restrictions still hold. We think of Yom Kippur as just a fast day, but in addition to not eating and drinking, there's other restrictions. No bathing, no anointing with oils or lotions or anything like that. I have to translate this back into English. No wearing leather shoes. There are some who thought you shouldn't wear shoes at all. And I'm missing one. What's the one I'm missing, Ruben?
Sexual relations.
Right. Yeah, that's the one I'm missing. How funny is that? Okay. Yeah, sexual relations. Yeah, no sexual relations.
And it says here, you shall afflict your souls.
Right. So all 5 of those restrictions, and eating and drinking is considered to be the self-same restriction. In fact, in the Talmud, they say, how it's really 6 restrictions. It's 6 forms of self-denial, not just 5, because there's eating and drinking. But there's actually eating and drinking is one. And then the others I mentioned, the last one being abstaining from intimacy, from sexual relations. So this section of Parashat Pinchas read on Yom Kippur. All right, skip ahead to verse 12. We're still in chapter 29. We're still in Pinchas. And if someone would read that first. Raise your hand if you want to read, if you have something in front of you. Zoe, go ahead.
On the 15th day of the 7th month, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. 7 days you shall observe a festival of the Lord.
Okay,
okay, and so and so.
Okay, and then I want you to skip ahead now, Zoe, to verse 17.
2nd day, 12 bulls of the herd, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish,
etc., etc. Okay,
etc.
Verse 20.
3rd day, 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish.
Go to verse 23.
4th day, 10 bulls, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish,
etc., etc. Verse 26.
5th day, 9 bulls, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish.
Now verse 29.
6th day, 8 bulls, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish.
And then verse 32.
7th day, 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 yearling lambs without blemish.
Okay, so I'm going to stop right now. What holiday? So in America, we actually, and the diaspora, any place outside of Israel, we actually celebrate this holiday.
Now it's Sukkot.
It would be Sukkot.
It's Sukkot, right? It's Sukkot. So that's Sukkot again. Does it say Sukkot anywhere in there? It just says sacred occasion. Doesn't mention anything about Sukkot. There is another Torah portion, Parshat Emor, in the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, that does talk about the Arba Minim, the 4 species, the lulav and etrog, all that jazz, and the sitting in huts for 7 days. But this is just about the sacrifices, the additional sacrifices for Sukkot. So these are all read on Sukkot. If you turn to the next page, page 936, verse 35, and you're on a roll, Zoe, so keep going.
Okay, on the 8th day, you shall hold a solemn gathering. Okay, this is very different.
Right.
You shall not work at your occupations. You shall present a burnt offering, a gift of pleasing odor to the Lord. 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 yearling lambs without blemish.
Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what holiday is that referring to?
Shmini
And
Atzeret.
Yes.
Atzeret, right. So if you actually look at, and I think Risa has read this before, this exact Torah reading, verse 35, it says, Bayom HaShemini, Atzeret tihi alachem. So even the words Shmini Atzeret are right in there. So that's read on Shmini Atzeret. In Israel, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah take place on the same day, but we have 2 separate holidays. One day is Shmini Atzeret, one is Simchat Torah, and this is read on both of those days. So just how the first 2 days of Sukkot in the diaspora have the same reading from Parashat Pinchas, so too the last Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah we consider our last 2 days, but in Israel there's only 1 day would be reading this section, the Shmini Atzeret one. And yeah, so that's Parashat Pinchas, the part you know. Maybe not the part you know and love, but definitely the part you know, because that's always the second Torah scroll that we take out. Sometimes there's one occasion, this is a trivia question, there's one time a year where we take out, possibly we could take out 3 Torah scrolls, and we do read this out of one of the Sifrey Torah, but there's another reading on that day as well. And I think Al knows the answer to this, but maybe someone else wants to venture a guess as well.
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah. Okay. So
Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, Hanukkah.
Rosh Chodesh Hanukkah, right. So it's not just any Hanukkah, right? It would have to be Hanukkah when it also coincides with Rosh Chodesh. So let me show you that. I'm going to go back to the Heeb Cal. Let's go to that.
There's also the obvious Simchas Torah, where we have 3 Torahs.
Right. Yes. So let me, so what did I just say I was going to look up? I forgot.
Rosh Chodesh Hanukkah.
No, Hanukkah, right. So we're going to look here. I'm going the wrong direction. So Hanukkah, Kislev, Cheshvan, Kislev, 23rd, 25th of Kislev is here. But if you see here, the Shabbat is not a Shabbat Rosh Chodesh. So if you look this year on 2021, it's December 27th, 2021. We read the regular Torah reading, which is in the cycle of reading from Bereshit, which from Parshat Vayeshev, and I'll click on that. Okay, Parshat Vayeshev, this is what we read from Genesis 37:1 to 40:23. If you're doing the full Kriya, the triennial reading is about a third of that. But in addition to that, you also read something special for Hanukkah. Actually, no, I'm sorry, you don't, because Hanukkah doesn't start right. So this year we don't even have a Shabbos like this, right? I'll look at the next Shabbos. So the 27th, we still haven't lit our first candle, so we only read Parshat Vayeshev. But if we look at, and I'm sorry, I said December, I meant November. December, okay, here we go. This is what I was looking for. December 4th. Okay, the December 4th, which is the 30th of Kislev, it's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. Okay, so we read the regular Torah reading for the day, which is Miketz. That's the story of Yosef interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. So if we click on Miketz, there you have your Genesis 41:1 to 44:17. And that's not all we read, though. If you look here, we also read Numbers 28:9 through 15. That's Parshat Pinchas. That's our Rosh Chodesh reading. And then in addition to that, we have a third reading, And we, even though it's from the same book, from Numbers, it's customary to have a third scroll so that you don't have to have a tir chaded tzibura to have to roll the scroll in real time. And this Numbers chapter 7, verses 42 to 47 happens to be Parshat Naso. That's a special reading that we do for Hanukkah, right? So that's a special deal there. But this business that I've been trying to call your attention to, Pinchas, it's all over the place. So we love this parsha, or I love this parsha for this and many more. I don't know if the Steins are on.
It's interesting because on December 4th, we also changed a little bit of the reading in the Amida. We not?
Yes,
Yes, right. So in the Musaf, in the Sidur, there's this couple of pages there where it says, if it's the first 2 days of Passover, add this. If it's the last 2 days of Passover, read this. If it's Sukkot, read this. And all of those are quotes from Parshat Pinchas. The reason I mentioned the Steins is because if I'm not mistaken, Andrew Stein's Hebrew name is Pinchas. And
You're right.
I get it right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So Parshat Pinchas, so even though he read from, I believe, Parshat Lech Lecha, or Vayera, not Lech Lecha. He read Vayera. I still think of so I think of Andrew not only at Parshat Vayera, but also at Parshat Pinchas because of his name. So there you have it. Okay, next case. So that's a big piece of Parshat Pinchas. There's also narrative in Parshat Pinchas, and I hope we can get to at least a little bit of it. So let us turn to Numbers chapter 25. And Numbers chapter 25, part of it is at the end of Parshat Balak, and part of it is at the beginning of Parshat Pinchas. So you may have to go, if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash and there's the Haftorah there in the middle, you may have to go back a few pages, as I'm going to have to do, because that's what I have. So in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, it's page 908. If you have other Chumashim, it should be pretty close it's chapter 25, verse 6.
Got it.
Okay. So would someone like to read that in English?
I got it.
Who's the I? Sandy? Okay, go ahead, Sandy.
I have the R.A. Kaplan, the Living Torah.
The purple book.
Yeah, purple book. Number 6. The judges were still sleeping.
No, wait. Where are you?
No.
Are you in are you in chapter 25 of Bamidbar, verse 6?
No. Chapter
25, verse 6.
Verse 6.
Yeah. It's Parshat Balak. It's the end of Parshat Balak.
Yeah.
Do you have in Hebrew, it should be V'hinei ish mi b'nei Yisrael ba?
V'hi ish, mi b'nei Yisrael ba. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So now read the English in verse 6.
Judges were still weeping in indecision at the communion tent entrance when an Israelite brought forth.
Oh, you're right. It's what did let's try to explain to everyone else. Right. I thought they're changing the order of the Hebrew words when they do the English translation to make it a smoother translation. So we'll hear some other translations, but Sandy, go ahead with yours. Sorry for correcting you.
When an Israelite brought forth a Midianite woman to his brethren for the eyes of Moses and the Israelite community. When Pinchas, the son of Eleazar and a grandson of Aaron, the priest, saw this, he rose up from the midst of the assemblage and took a spear in his hand. He followed the Israelite man into the tent's inner chamber and ran them through, driving the spear through the Israelite man and the woman's groin. With that, the plague had struck the Israelites, were arrested. In that plague, 24,000 people had died.
Okay, lovely. All right, so let's go back to the translation of the first verse before we get to the violent stabbing piece. Verse 6, Elaine, will you read what you have in the Eitz Chaim Chumash?
Sure. Just then, just then one of the Israelites came and brought a Midianite woman over to his companions in the sight of Moses and of the whole Israelite community, who were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting.
Right. So it's the same thing. It's just what the Eitz Chaim is going more in the order of the Hebrew words as they appear, and Sandy's just moved them a little bit forward. The key thing here is just to know that what's happening here is that there's a man whose name we don't know, a Midianite woman whose name we don't know, but the Torah just tells us that the two of them were together in the sight of Moses. What were they doing? Use your imagination. But if you look, some of the commentaries will say that they were having sex in public. Others said they weren't, but they were worshiping idols in public. There was something involved here that they were not supposed to be doing. And this was at the end of Parashat Balak, where the entire Parsha is, most of it is about Balak trying to curse Bnei Israel, and instead blessings come out of his mouth, or the way I talked about it in my Devar Torah, kind of blessings, quotes around it, blessings that were double-edged, that may be ambiguous enough that they could be perceived, so he could still intend them as curses. But in any event, what ends up happening, although it seems like Bilam doesn't get his way, Balak doesn't get his way, the Bnei Israel are not cursed, they end up cursing themselves. How true is this of the Jewish community? We have outsiders trying to curse us, do stuff, and we're our own worst enemy. Right here you have these people, and right here you have an Israelite man, and he decides, I'm just going to go consort with a Midianite woman, and we're going to worship idols. And we're not going to do this privately. We're going to do this in public. And if nothing were to have happened to him, then, and he got away with it, then perhaps other people would follow suit. So Pinchas doesn't want this to happen. So Pinchas, and let me just point out here, in English transliteration, when it's spelled E-L-E-A-Z-A-R or E-L-A-Z-A-R, it's not Eliezer, it's Elazar. So it's very close. It's the same root. If you Elazar is Aleph Lamed Ayin Zayin Resh. Eliezer is Aleph Lamed Yud Ayin Zayin Resh. Eliezer is the name given by the Midrash to Abraham's servant when he sent the servant to get a wife for Yitzchak. That servant's name is Eliezer. Elazar is a Kohen, and he is the father of Pinchas. And Elazar's father was Aharon. So Pinchas was the grandson of Aharon. Aharon, Aaron, as an older sibling of Miriam and Moshe. All right, so what do we think about this guy, Pinchas, from this? Yes, Al.
Okay, well, you did bring up in shul as well that, whether or not what he did was right or wrong, and whether or not he he took it upon himself. But if you go back just one verse to verse 5, it says, Moses said to Israel's officials, each of you slay those of his men who attach themselves to Baal Peor.
Right. So essentially, right, and I purposely did not want to start there because I was going to then go back, but you went back for us, which is great, right. Al. There's context here. The context is, and if you go back even further in chapter 25, it says here, where the kind of the header of this chapter, it's kind of dun, look out, bad news ahead. It says, Vayeshev Yisrael b'Shittim, Vayachel ha'am liznot el benot Moav. While Israel was staying at Shittim, the people profaned themselves by whoring with the Moabite women, who invited the people to the sacrifices for their God. So this is not just a statement against intermarriage, it's a statement against idol worship. And it seems like here, the big issue that Moshe has with Bnei Israel whoring with Moabite women or Midianite women, because those were both considered idol worshiping enemies and neighbors of Israel, is because there's the concern in verse 2 that those people will invite you to have sacrifices with them. The Hebrew word for that is translated here as whoring with the Moabite women is liznot. Znut is illicit sexual activity, prostitution. There's a curse in Hebrew, although you can call someone a ben zonah, not that I walk around cursing people in Israel, but a ben zonah is, it literally means son of a prostitute, but it's kind of the way we use
SOB.
SOB or worse, yeah. Yeah, it's I think it's a little stronger than SOB at this point, but it's that kind of idea. So there's this kind of right here in verse 4, God says to Moshe that take the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord. So there's actually God and Moshe setting the stage here for Pinchas. And when I talked about Pinchas in shul on Shabbat, I took it a little out of context because at the time I just said exactly what he did, and the nuanced view we might have about Pinchas, well, maybe it's a little bit less nuanced when we look at the context here. It's still not a pretty thing that he did. It was a very violent act, but you could understand why if you now turn to the beginning of Parashat Pinchas, and Elaine and anyone else who has the Eitz Chaim Chumash, the beginning of Parashat Pinchas is on page 918. The reason why it's all the way ahead is the Haftorah for Parshat Hukat and Balak are in the middle there. If anyone else does not have an Eitz Chaim Chumash, you can just go straight to Numbers chapter 25, verse 10. And here, it's going to be the second part of the story. So part A was what we saw at the end of Balak. And will someone read for us the beginning of Parshat Pinchas? And this is why it's called Pinchas. Terry, you want to unmute?
I have a question.
Yes.
It says that it was the end of a plague that 24,000 people died. There was never a mention of a plague until this moment.
Right. And the plague was because they were worshiping idols. Yeah, it's one of those like little details that we don't talk about, not because we're trying to hide anything, but as a rabbi, as someone who's sitting in shul, when you're reading Parshat Balak, there's all this stuff about talking donkeys and blessings and matovu. It's one fakakta verse about a plague, but now that we've just lived through a plague, we understand a little bit more that maybe it's not something to just be overlooked.
Was that the same amount as when Rabbi Akiva had his students, 24,000 also?
No, there were more.
No.
Elef Zugim. 12,000 pairs of students died in the plague with Rabbi Akiva.
So that's 24,000.
So it is the same number, yes.
But that was Mount Moron, right?
Good, that was great trivia, Terry. That was pretty impressive. You get the prize for that one. All right, so let's go back now to Pinchas. So Terry, would you like to read? Do you have a Chumash in front of you?
We don't have a book.
You don't have a book. Okay, so someone who does have a book, can you read this? Or I can, let's see, somebody who has, Rick, go ahead.
The Lord spoke to Moses saying, Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the Israelites by displaying among them his passion for me, so that I did not wipe out the Israelite people in my passion. Say therefore, I grant him my pact of friendship. It shall be for him and his descendants after him a pact of priesthood for all time, because he took impassioned action for his God, thus making expiation for the Israelites.
Keep going.
Keep going. The name of the Israelite who was killed, the one who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, son of Salu, chieftain of a Simeonite ancestral house. The name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, daughter of Zur. He was the tribal head of an ancestral house of Midian. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, assail the Midianites and defeat them, for they assailed you by the trickery they practiced against you, because of the affair of Peor and because of the affair of their kinswoman Cosbi, daughter of the Midianite chieftain, who was killed at the time of the plague on account of Peor.
Okay.
So before, though, it was an unnamed man and an unnamed woman.
Yeah, before it was an unnamed man and an unnamed woman, and now we have names. And I'm going to share with you some commentary. And so now those of you who don't have books will be able to see some text here. I like to alternate back and forth between putting the text and not having, because when I have it on the screen, I can only see a few boxes at a time. So here, let's do this. There we go. Some number is 25. Okay, so all right, so this part about the naming. Okay, so we didn't have the names of these people, and now we do. And why is this significant? Well, we're going to see, because there's some commentary here that does imbue this with significance. So right here, I'll read the verse 14 again in Hebrew. V'shem ish Yisrael hamukeh asher huka et hamidyanit Zimri ben Salu nasi beit av l'shimoni, which already Rick read in English translation. And let me show you some commentary. Give me a moment. Okay, so first of all, before we get to the name, just you see this Rashi here, that this is stated to show you the hatred the Midianites bore to Israel, that they abandoned even a princess to prostitution in order to make Israel sin. So that's pretty strong. So what did I want to show you? Here we go. I wanted to show you this. Now I'm going to show you Midrash Tanchuma. So what I did is when you click on the verse in Sefaria, you can go to commentary and pick Rashi. And then when you're in Rashi, if Rashi is citing a Midrash, as he does here, then you get the Midrash put on here on the screen as well. So all the way on the right this is from Midrash Tanchuma. Okay. And the name of the slain man of Israel. So that's the biblical quote. Just as the Holy One, blessed be he, is concerned with the praise of the righteous to publicize them throughout the world, so is he concerned with the disgrace of the wicked to publicize them throughout the world. He publicized Pinchas for praise and publicized Zimri for disparagement. About them it is stated, and this is a verse from Mishlei, Proverbs chapter 10, the remembrance of a righteous one is for a blessing, but the name of the wicked shall rot. And then we'll go to this next part in a moment. I wanted to show it to you in Hebrew too, because I want to show you a couple of things. So first of all, you know the term HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the Holy One, blessed be God. Okay, so Kishem HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitasek b'shivchan shel tzadikim lefarsiman ba'olam, kach mitasek bignut harishaim lefarsiman ba'olam. So these two key words here are gnut and shevach, that's in Shivchan. Shevach is praise, Genut is disparagement, negative words. So Pirsem Pinchas l'shevach, he publicized Pinchas and his lineage in order to be praiseworthy to him and to his family. Upirsem Zimri, this man who was caught with the Midianite woman, the princess, he's Gnai. Okay, he is negative. And then this is what I wanted to show you. This term, may have heard of the term Zichrono Livracha. You might have heard Zecher Tzadik Livracha, like Zatzal. So when there's a famous rabbi like Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, oftentimes after his name, instead of it being just a Zion Lamed, it'll be Zion Sadi Lamed. Instead of just a ZL, it'll be Z and then something representing a Tzadi and then L. And this is what it's from. It's from this verse in Mishlei, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. So I wanted you to see that. I also wanted you to see.
While you're there, before you go, the Harashaim. And it's like, it's from Passover, Rasha, the wicked son.
The wicked son. Yeah, let me go back to the Hebrew there. Yeah, Vishem Rishaim, you're covering. We know Haman Harasha, right? Haman the wicked. So that's all there. So let us go back to, why these names. So Rashi here on commenting about the woman's name, the fact that oops, sorry, I'm going back. Here we go. When we were talking about the woman's name, and it says, we read this one, it's what I read before. It's very significant, not only that we know her name, that it's Cosby Batsur, but it's really important that she's a Midianite woman. She's a Midianite woman because, as Rashi said, based on Midrash Tanchuma, that we want to, it's disgraceful to the Midianites that they sent even a princess to, they were so willing to and anxious to get Bnei Israel to sin by worshiping idols that they were even willing to have their princesses lure Bnei Israel, Israelite men, into idol worship. But if we go to the previous verse, the one where it talks about the man, Shem Ha'ish. Okay, so this is what Rashi has to say. Will someone read this Rashi here? B'Shem Ish Yisrael, the name of the Israelite who was smitten. I think we read this. Someone read this before. Let's read it again. Al, will you read it?
Whenever it gives the genealogy of a good man in praise of him, it gives the genealogy of a bad man mentioned in the same story to disparage him.
Right. So I did some of the translations and showed you the Hebrew of Midrash Tanchuma from which this is taken, but I didn't show you the Hebrew for the Rashi. Okay. Rashi is much more succinct. B'makom sheyiches et hatzadik l'shevach, yiches et harasha lignai. So all that very long thing that we read in Tanchuma gets really shortened here in Rashi. So what does this come to teach us? What is the purpose of all of this? Just from just the Rashi that we read and other,
Don't fool around with Midianite women.
Okay, so there's one of the lessons here is don't fool around with Midianite women, but there's more to it, because it's not just saying, because we could have had a thou shalt not, but instead there's a story. And not just do we have a story, but we have a story and we have names. We have all this detail. Why the detail and not just don't worship idols? We did that already twice, in fact. In Parshat Vayitro and Vayet Hanan, we're told don't worship idols. What does this story teach us?
Does it have anything to do with the sacrifices that we read about before?
I don't think so, but perhaps, do you want to flesh that out a little bit? No pun intended.
Well, it kept repeating for all the holidays, all the different, animals that you sacrifice. So that was an important.
So it's possible, maybe. I mean, I haven't seen anything like that, but it certainly looks like you could potentially look at this couple who committed this sin as a sacrificial offering in a way. But usually when we think of sacrifices, we think of good, right? Here, they were killed and they were not pure. The sacrifices, as you recall, they all had to be without blemish. This couple was quite the opposite of without blemish. So let's unpack it a little more, just based on the Midrashim that I shared with you and the Rashi. I think there's, go ahead, Risa.
It's a natural feeling, urge that if somebody does something good, you praise them. And sometimes we don't want to publicize when somebody did something not so good. We want to hush it. And here it's saying, don't hush the bad. If you have to disparage somebody, if you have to bring out the negative acts that were done, you have to say those too.
Right. And you have to name the person by name. This is not just an abstract concept. I'm going to read, rather than, because of time, rather than my pulling it up on the screen, I'm going to read to you another Midrash from Bamidbar Rabbah, 21, section 3. And in talking about the name, it says here, Kishem Shakadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, I read that part already. Okay, so the part I read out loud that ended with that Mishlei verse, this Midrash goes on to say, Shekol hapogem et atzmo, pogem et mishpachto imo. If a person tarnishes his own reputation, he tarnishes the reputation of his family with him. So part, I think, of what the lesson is here and why these names are here is that when someone does something wrong, it's not just, okay, it's this person and they get their punishment. It has repercussions on the family. The reputation of the family is at stake. Zoe, go ahead.
Yeah, but how do you distinguish between what is being said here and Lashon Hara, where you don't necessarily share bad things? It becomes gossip.
Yes, so it's now, you're right. Now here, because it's not so much conversational, I would agree with you, Zoe, if it was just us having a conversation about what happened while we were there, did you hear, what's his name? That would be more in the gossip. Here, it's more the Torah telling us something happened. We know these people had names. The Torah chose not to tell us those names in the end of Parashat Balak, but here at the beginning of Parashat Pinchas, it wants to tell us these names. And it wants to tell us these names because of conveying this lesson, not that we should be talking about these people behind their backs, but that the Torah wants us to know because no one's actions are without consequence for a larger sphere. In fact, I want to share something else with you. It's a different parsha, but it's a very similar idea. Let me share screen. In Parshat Emor, which by the way is the other parsha that has all these holiday things in it, not holiday references, and that's read as additional readings on Sukkot and other times. Chapter 24 of Leviticus, the blasphemer in chapter 24, verse 11. The son of the Israelite woman pronounced the name in blasphemy, and he was brought to Moses. Now his mother's name was Shlomit, daughter of Dibri of the tribe of Dan, and he was placed in custody until the decision of the Lord should be made clear to them. So we're not exactly sure what he did. He did some kind of cursing. He either cursed God or he cursed someone else in the name of God. He did some kind of using God's name, Yud-He, Vav-He, in an inappropriate way. And we're not just told that it was a guy. First we're told it's a guy, but then we're told his mother's name, Shlomit, the daughter of Dibri, and what tribe he's from. And the reason why this is here, I'm going to read something else. This is Rashi. Let me go into Rashi, commentary, Rashi. Yeah, so I don't know if this is too small to read. Can someone read all the way on the right? This is Rashi commentary on Lamate Dan of the tribe of Dan. Risa, go ahead.
This mention also of the parent and tribe of the woman teaches us that the wrongdoer brings shame upon himself, shame upon his parents, shame upon his whole tribe. Similarly, we find the name of the tribe Dan mentioned to express praise. Oholiab, the son of Achisamach of the tribe of Dan, where the details of Oholiab's descent imply praise for him, praise for his father, and praise for his tribe.
Okay, and there in parentheses is where it's from. So
Yes.
same idea here. It's not Lashon Hara, so you're right. If it was just this happened and did you hear and people are gossiping about it, that clearly would be something that the Torah would object to. But here it's the Torah telling us you can't just go around using God's name inappropriately. You can't just go around cursing. You can't just go around being a blasphemer and think that it's just going to be that you get a punishment and we're done. It's a much larger sphere that you're affecting. And here, I think it's funny, they just mentioned his mother. It's always the mother's fault, right? She's on the psychiatrist's couch and dad maybe had nothing to do with it, but mom, sure, Shlomit, Bat Divri, and then, well, the tribe gets blamed as well. So this idea in a very larger sense, in the Talmud, in Masechet Shavuot 39a, there's a phrase you might have heard before, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zebazeh, which here is translated as the entire Jewish people are considered guarantors for one another. It's also translated sometimes as all Jewish people are responsible for one another. In the larger sense, this statement also means that when you do something wrong and you are Jewish and people know that you're Jewish, you're not just casting aspersions on yourself, you are causing disgrace to a much larger sphere, not just your mom, not just your family, not just your tribe, but the whole Jewish people. And there's this concept of Chilul Hashem and Kiddush Hashem. Chilul Hashem is when somebody does something that is really wrong and they're Jewish, and then people who are then looking from the outside would say, oh, the Jews did this. Like it happened. I think of all the examples of criminals who were Jewish, and every Jewish person in the world goes like this and says, "Oy, Achen Vede, they have to be Jewish." You know, Ivan Botsky, Oy, right? Every single
Rabbi Bergman.
Right.
Rabbis who do things that are inappropriate. Every time.
Then it says
You
Shonda
don't
for
have
the
to go
Goyim.
through the list.
It's a shanda, right? It's a shanda.
Shonda for the Goyim.
And it comes from this
Exactly.
concept. So in Parashat Pinchas, it's on a much more micro level. It's just telling us Zimri, Benzel, it tells you the parents' names. And for Cosby, we know what, you know, her father was a Midianite priest and that she was a princess, or we get that whole business. But in Parshat Emor, it goes one step further. It impugns the tribe. And then if we look in that section of the Talmud, it impugns all of Israel, all of Bnei Israel. On the flip side, on the positive side, when you have Jewish Nobel Prize winners or Jewish people doing amazing things, helping other people, saving people's lives, that's considered great. We're always so happy to hear when that's a Jewish person, because that's the opposite of the Shanda. That is a real Kiddush Hashem, an act of a sanctification of God's name. So
it's like, Rabbi, like this week when we heard, in my mind anyway, I'm sure everybody else or some people thought the same thing, when you heard that Israel sent their first aid people and everyone down to South, to the collapsed building in Florida. Yay, Israel, has come to the rescue. You feel pride in that. And the opposite when you hear the rabbi who's a slumlord in, some building in Brooklyn or wherever. Oh my God, Shonda for the Jews.
Exactly, right. So I think that's a piece of this parsha that often goes unnoticed. One last piece of the parsha that we're clearly not going to be able to go into in depth, but I did want to point out to you, and some of you have studied this with me in Wild Women, at the very end of, not the end, at the next chapter, before the very end of narrative portions, before we get to all of those sacrifices, those pieces of Pinchas that are read on holidays and Rosh Chodesh, if you go to Numbers chapter 27, we have a very famous story here. The heroines are known as Binot Slofchad, the daughters of Slofchad.
They're my favorites.
I love them, right? So because they're your favorites, Sandy, will you read the first couple of lines just so we can get a tape, and then I'll summarize and call it a night.
A petition was presented by the daughters of Slofchad, son of Hefer, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the family of Joseph's son Manasseh, The names of these daughters were Machla, Noah, Shagla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They now stood before Moses. Eleazar, the priest, the princes, and the entire community at the communion tent entrance with the following petition. Our father died in the desert. He was not among the members of Korach's party who protested against God, but he died because of his own sin without leaving any sons. Why should our father's name be disadvantaged in his family merely because he did not have a son? Give us a portion of land along with our father's brothers. Moses brought the case before God.
Okay, and then God actually answers in the affirmative. So the spoiler alert here in verse 6 is Vayomer Hashem Moshe Lemor, Ken benot Tzlofchad dovrot. The daughters of Tzlofchad, they speak well. Their plea that they speak is just, it's good. You should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen. You should let them inherit land. Even though the law of the land right now seems to be, and this is what Benot Tzlofchad are complaining about, only sons can inherit. These 5 gutsy women came forward and said, no, that's not fair. Zelo fair, as they say in Hebrew. So we deserve a place, and that is exactly what happens. And the daughters of Tzlofchad, their story is told in 2 parts. Part of it is in Parashat Pinchas here in Numbers 27. Part of it is also in Numbers 36, which is Parshat Matot, and that's the spoiler alert on that, which because you won't be reading that for quite a few weeks, is that yes, they are able to inherit land, but there ends up being a caveat. We have to, Moshe and God have to balance the needs of this individual family with the needs of the community writ large. And there's concern that if daughters inherit as well as sons, and what if the daughters marry out of the tribe? What if they marry people who are outside of the tribe of Manasseh? Then what's going to happen to this land? And there was in the beginning, when Bnei Israel entered into the land, there were certain portions that were allocated to each tribe. So in Numbers 36, it's kind of a compromise. It's saying, yes, Benot Tzlofchad, yes, daughters of Tzlofchad, you can inherit your father's land, but you have to marry other people from the men from the tribe of Manasseh, so that the next generation, the land can stay in the family in the sense of the tribal unit. So Benot Tzlofchad, there are just many wonderful things to say about them. First of all, the name Noah, which we think of as for so many years have thought of as a male name, in Hebrew it's Noach, Nun Chet, Noach. This name is not Nun Chet, it's Nun Ayin, sometimes spelled Nun Ayin Hey, and it's Noah. And I remember in the beginning when it first became popular, like I said, it was about 10 years ago, maybe more than that at this point, you started hearing girls named Noah and say, why is her name Noah? No, is it like a boy's name, a girl's name? It's spelled completely differently. So yes, there are names that can go for a different.
Very popular today.
It's very, very popular.
I know two babies already this
My
year.
niece is already almost 35, if her name is Noah.
No. And also the name Achinoam, which is, there are some people like Achinoam Nini, Israeli performer, her name is shortened to Noah, so Noah becomes a short form of a longer name, as well as a name in and of itself, as one of the daughters of Tzlofchad. The other names of the daughters of Tzlofchad didn't become so popular. They didn't take on so much. I mean, Tirzah, I actually have a friend from my rabbinical school class whose name is Tirzah, but I don't know any Machlas and Choglas, probably because it's just too hard to say, but doesn't sound as pretty as Tirzah and Noah. Anyway, I wanted to end with a couple of texts relating to the daughters of Tzlofchad. So one is from Pirkei Avot. So Pirkei Avot, let me put it on the screen. Pirkei Avot, you can find it in a Siddur and on Sefaria. Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, Mishnah 5. These are a whole bunch of sayings of Hillel. One in the previous one, some of my favorites here. Al tomar l'kashe ipane eshne Hashem lo tipane. Say not, when I shall have leisure, I shall study, perhaps you will not have leisure. But here Hillel goes on, and in the very last part of this Mishnah, he says, Uvamakom she'ein anashim hishtadel lihiyot ish. In a place where there are no men, strive to be a man. And the translation here is strive to be a man, but I think it's man more in the sense of a mensch, like doing the right thing. Yeah. And in fact, I think I have, yeah. See if it has it. Yeah, I can't pick it up quickly, but there's a couple of translations say it means doing the right thing. When everyone else is sitting around and doing nothing, you should stand up and do the right thing. And in fact, there is a commentary in, it is Sifrey Zuta, and it specifically looks at this quote, "B'makom she'ein anashim hishadel li'yor ish," and applies it to the daughters of Tzlofchad. So it's not just my trying to be in the 21st century politically correct and gender neutral, and let's say that this line didn't really mean men, it could be men and women, people could be non-binary people, could be transgender, could be whoever. It's not just that, it's not just a 21st century sensibility. It's even in ancient times and some of our traditional commentaries, the idea was this was not meant to be a gendered statement by Hillel. It was meant to refer to doing the right thing. In Yiddish, we say mensch, which does mean man, but is there a feminine form of mensch that you could use to compliment a woman who's done similarly menschlich things? I don't know. Does anyone, some of our Yiddish speakers, Elaine, do you know, what would you call a woman who does menschlich things? Would you call her a mensch as well, or something else?
Yeah, I think. I mean, as far as I would know.
So it's not so gendered. So I wanted to read to you, because as my final word here on the topic here of Pinchas, Parashat Pinchas, and specifically Benot Tzlofchad. I wrote an article back in 2007 that I just found as I've been packing. I don't even have an electronic version of it. I have like the original newspaper article with a picture where I look like I'm 12, but I think I was older than that. And it says, so I'll read it to you. Parashat Pinchas relates two narratives that seem to have nothing to do with one another: the violent story of the religious zealot Pinchas and the tale of property transactions with the daughters of Tzlofchad. We first encountered Pinchas at the end of last week's portion, Balak. Bnei Israel were whoring after foreign gods and foreign women. One Israelite, Zimri ben Salu, was quite brazen. He decided to consort with a foreign woman in an act of public disobedience against God. Aaron's grandson, Pinchas, took a spear and pierced the bellies of Zimri and his Midianite lover, Cosbi. Pinchas's vigilante act was motivated by jealousy, passion, and zeal on God's behalf. In this week's portion, Pinchas, God expressed approval of Pinchas's actions, viewing his murderous act as praiseworthy. Thus, God rewarded Pinchas with a covenant of peace, a brit shalom. God promised that the legacy of Pinchas and the rest of the Kohanim would last forever. Later on in the same parsha, the Torah presents a very different type of scenario. Replacing the violent murder is a peaceful scene that involves a legal property transaction. Instead of a fearless, zealous vigilante, we encounter 5 shrewd, even-tempered businesswomen. The daughters of Tzlofchad approached Moshe because they felt it was unjust if they didn't inherit their father's land. The daughters wouldn't stand for the injustice of this land not being passed on to the next generation just because there were no male heirs. These assertive women approached Moshe, Eleazar the Kohen, and the congregational chieftains in a public sacred space and said to them, "Give us an inheritance in the land of Canaan." Here we encounter 2 very different types of people. On the one hand, the shrewd, mild-mannered daughters of Tzlofchad, and on the other hand, the zealous, violent Pinchas. Yet despite the apparent differences, there is a thematic linkage between them. In commentaries on both of these narratives, a reference is made to the same quote of Hillel from Pirkei Avot, chapter 2. And that quote, that's what I just shared with you, "B'makom she'ein anashim histadel lihiyot ish," which I translated here as, in a situation where there aren't any men, try to be a man. What Hillel seems to be saying is, when you're in a situation where no one seems to be doing the right thing, you step up and do the right thing. The commentary Al HaTorah applies this quote to Pinchas. By killing the offenders Zimri and Cosbi, he was making a statement against assimilation and against exogamy. When most of the people around him were whoring after foreign women, Pinchas defied the majority and advocated obedience to God. The Midrash Sifrey Zuta applies Hillel's quote from Pirkei Avot to the daughters of Tzlofchad. The daughters exemplified the quote by believing in God's promises when most of the other members of their generation did not. Israelites in that generation continually fetched to Moshe and to God, expressing their desire to return to Egypt. They were unappreciative of all that God and Moses had done to help them, and they doubted that Hashem would bring them to the promised land. The humble request of the daughters for a property inheritance in Canaan reflected their abiding emunah, their belief and faith in God. While on the surface, the narratives of Pinchas and Benot Tzlofchad are quite different, both teach the same lesson. When you are in a situation and no one seems to be doing the right thing, you should step up and do the right thing. When the majority of people around us avoid appearing too Jewish and are not committed to the observance of Jewish laws and customs, it is our obligation to stand apart from the majority by proudly expressing our connection to God, Judaism, and Torah, and Israel. Of course, it's much easier to believe in God or to do mitzvot or to stand up for Israel when everyone around you is doing the same. The challenge is to be able to stand up for Judaism, God, Torah, and Israel, even or maybe especially when others are not. Okay, here, Red Zone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we're just ready for minyan.
יישר כוח, אבא.
Bruchim.